Welcome back, everyone. This is episode 2.5 of the Mesopotamian series by the History Hour with Mr. Kent
and Professor White.
This is episode 2.5 because it's not going to be a full episode. So far, we've more or less followed along chronologically and given our commentary on Mesopotamian history, but we're going to jump back a little bit to the dynastic period. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Sumerian king list and probably my favorite really obscure person from history. We talked about the King's List previously. It is one of the most significant pieces for scholarship because it lists so many people. The beginning of the King's List tends to be much more mythology, but the later part tends to be more real kings, and the dates are a little bit closer, and it gives us real insight to who was really considered significant, when, and all this other stuff. Also helps us put together when events unfolded and how. So we're going to be talking about one of the individuals in the king list who was in a couple hundred years before Sargon. This king was one of the defining people of the era just before the rise of the Akkadian Empire. And this is the only female queen on the entire list. Queen of Kish Kugbao, or Kugbo, or later Kubaba. Kugbao is listed in the king list as in Kish, Kugbao, the woman tavern keeper who made firm the foundations of Kish, became king. She ruled for 100 years. One king, she ruled for 100 years. Then Kish was defeated, some texts also say and destroyed, and the kingship was taken to Aksak. Now from here, it lists the Aksak rulers, and then at the end of the Aksak rulers, of which there are several, it says 5 kings, they ruled for 87 years. So the reign of Aksak was abolished and the kingship was taken to Kish. From there, it talks about the Kish dynasty that was founded by her son and their reign. They're eventually defeated by Lugal-Zaggisi, which in this version is called the King of Unug, but you know as Uruk. The interesting thing I find about Kugbao is that she is the one female queen on the list, and she has a achievement and a profession noted to her. On my list, not every king has an achievement, but they often do things like they repair foundations, they build temples, they subdue a barbarian people. She restores the foundations, and she's also listed to be a tavern keeper. There are a handful of occupations listed in the Mari reign just before Kish. You actually see Bazi, the leather worker, who ruled for 30 years, and it's possible that not only was she an awesome tavern keeper and made everyone beers and they elect her queen, but likely she may have been part of a prominent council of citizens, that sort of quasi-democracy that may have elected kings or made full-on decisions prior to Insi and Lugals. Whatever the case, she founded her own dynasty and was defeated, but then the dynasty came back, regained power, and dominated the region for some time. And it also notes that there is the queen after her for 100 years. Possible that's exactly the same person, or maybe she did have a daughter who reigned and it was her daughter who sired that dynasty. We're not 100% sure, but most sources indicate they think that those two are the same person. So it begs the question, exactly how does this happen? How does a woman tavern keeper rise to become the most powerful political leader in all of Sumeria? And it does certainly indicate that at the time, the ability for someone to come to power, to exercise their power, was not as difficult as in later reigns. You didn't have to be from a very established royal dynasty. You didn't have to command a tribe. You didn't have to necessarily have this sort of divine right invested. Instead, likely, this person earned it. This Kugbao was likely some sort of prominent business person, probably a prominent person in the community, obviously had what the people at the time would have considered the right priorities in rebuilding the foundations, which could have meant they repaired the foundations of a major temple or maybe the walls of the city. It's not entirely clear, but either one would have been very important, either to retain the favor of the gods or to repel enemy armies. But this person seemingly got there through their own deeds. Seemingly, they were not given it because they were the daughter of a previous king, not because they were from a powerful family, but because that person had legitimately earned the trust and reverence of either the majority of the city or perhaps the other elders. It's possible that it was a dynastic crisis, that after the death of a previous Insi, a previous Lugal, they needed someone, and she was the person who filled that void, the person who they felt could actually steer the city toward a brighter future. And that you do have this sort of pattern of myth-making. You have Kugbao is not only the only female king on the list, not only the founder of her own dynasty, which is more or less right directly prior to Lugal Zagesi and Sargon, but you actually have her in later periods become a straight-up deity, and she's called Kubaba. The deification of kings is an interesting thing because it not only represents a flexibility of more or less a working person to become a king in their own right, it represents the ability for a king, in this example, a working person, to actually become a god. It's a transition from not the lowest segments of society, because obviously she was not a slave, but it does represent a massive amount of fluidity, the ability for someone, more or less through their own efforts, their own hard work, to rise to prominence, to become a major person in the city, to become a trusted figure, and then become the queen, and then later become an actual god in the culture. There's very few people in this king list who actually have the sort of footprint she has, and I would imagine almost everyone here has never heard of her. Before I took a class on Mesopotamia, I'd never. It's an interesting thing to think how many of these people have these intricate stories. There are hundreds, potentially, kings in this king list, or the alternate king list with their other kings that are not listed and have been lost to history. When you consider these hundreds and thousands of years, how many micro stories are played out that we never get to hear of? How many dynasties had their own internal struggles? And how many cities developed some sort of social system or some sort of breakthrough that is simply lost, is simply something we will never ever know about? The thousands of years that we cover and these reigns of kings that we cover, it represents generations of ingenuity and of innovation and of struggle.
Another thing to note, especially in the early dynastic period, which is the period we're talking about with Kublai, is that the political power wasn't quite so stratified. Yeah, there were kings, but we talked about the development of economic groups, these proto-guilds that various different classes of workers were part of, and that these guilds weren't just economic associations. They had leaders who were perhaps elected by the members of that organization. That these leaders did exert not just influence over their fellow workers or over the economic fields which they worked in, but also seemed to have real political power to a sense, being advisors to royal families and dynasties. And so perhaps it's possible that Kublai was selected as the leader of some sort of guild of brewers, which would have been a very important organization, given the fact that production and consumption of alcohol is a pretty prominent part of most life in the ancient world. You mentioned other figures like that leather worker from Mari, perhaps. A similar story happens there. It is fascinating that we use the word king as a translation for things like Ensi and Lugal, but it's not really a very accurate term in a lot of ways. King to us has a very specific connotation of a bloodline or a family or at very least an exalted personage inside this stratified aristocratic system. And kings in early Mesopotamia don't really seem to have had that. They might have been seen as being significantly important people, priests or military commanders, even as gods. But the origins of these leaders, again, seems to rest a lot more on practicality and, who's in the best position to do the job at the time. What's also interesting to me is that if you look at the entirety of the kings list, and even kings who aren't on the list, there aren't that many kings in Mesopotamia that were deified. Unlike, say, Egypt, where by default the pharaoh is a god on earth, there's only a handful of Sumerian kings that have religious reverence attached to them. And some, like Gilgamesh, he was already a demigod before he was a king, according to legends, which, again, Gilgamesh is a complicated topic in its own right. But yeah, you have to do something to really impress the people if you got that particular accolade attached to your reign name.
Yeah, and contrast that with the Ur dynasty, where they largely sort of began to degrade the rule of religion and degrade the power of the Ensi in the temple while deifying their own kings, and that was viewed as a sort of unpopular thing. Their sort of pseudo-state secularism was not a thing that people enjoyed. It was something that led to resentment, led to rebellion. These figures who are deified earlier, who aren't deified as practice, but are kind of that way because either they have a popularity or because they are the most prominent person in a dynastic line that held a great deal of power, it's a little more accepted, and you actually see it fall into the culture and become incorporated. And to consider how these people became kings, a modern listener might think, well, that's really silly. That person gets made king. The son of the king or this person is just some tavern keeper or leather worker. It's not the most logical thing that they should be king. In reality, even if you consider the modern political systems that the majority of our listeners that we live under, these democratic systems, how does someone gain the prominence in order to actually be elected president? current president in 2019, Donald Trump, he's got his supposed business acumen. He made his fame through business and real estate and reality TV. George Walker Bush, one could really argue, got to be president because he was the son of a previous president. It's not so dissimilar from dynasties. And if you compare, say, these conquerors to gain power, it's not so dissimilar from the way many of our prominent presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Washington, were all military leaders.